Now.
On 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app.
O'Connor and Company.
It's 6:07. It's O'Connor and Company on this Thursday morning. It's the 27th day of June. My gosh, and it's debate day. We'll give you a preview coming up. Also at 7:05, Mark Chenoweth, New Civil Liberties Alliance. We're going to talk about his topic in just a moment here. 7:35, Betsy DeVos, former Trump Education Secretary. She's been on that bus tour to save women's sports and protect Title IX, and we'll get her firsthand account and what happened yesterday with Speaker Johnson and Riley Gaines on Capitol Hill. 8:05, KT McFarland. It's Larry O'Connor alongside our friend Bethany Mandel, who joins us again after a bit of a hiatus there with lots of things going on in your life. Bethany, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me for 4 hours. My Lord. This was...
I would thank you for being here, but honestly, I mean, you've got 6 kids, and your husband, Seth Mandel, is a nightmare. So this is like a vacation for you.
It really,
to be able to
truly
come here
is.
And escape.
Minus the nightmare, because that poor schmuck is putting 4 kids on a bus and 2 kids at the babysitter, and I'm just sitting here hanging out with my friend Larry.
He's a wonderful man.
I love him.
A mensch, the
I
kids
love
like
him.
to say. As I mentioned, coming up at 7:05, Mark Chenoweth is joining us. He's the president of New Civil Liberties Alliance. Now, he represents Dr. Jayanta Bhattacharya. If that name sounds familiar, he's great. He was a clear clarion voice all through the COVID-19 pandemic. He is a medical doctor, a professor at Stanford University. He knows a thing or two about viruses and about what public policy should be and the medical effects of various policies. And he spoke out and he dissented from many of the things that the Trump administration through CDC was telling us, and the Biden administration. The Biden administration hated this guy's opinion so much that agencies of the U.S. government were mobilized to communicate to social media platforms like Twitter to delete his tweets, put pressure on him to delete his tweets, and threaten censorship and silencing of him. Twitter was doing the censorship, but they were doing it under pressure from the Biden administration. Sounds like an infringement of the First Amendment, doesn't it? Well, you're wrong, apparently, because according to the Supreme Court, who ruled 6-3 in favor of the Biden administration, there was no standing for the states who were suing here or for the doctor to even bring this case in the first place. Now, I just want to be clear, and I used my words carefully, by saying in the Murphy versus Missouri case that there was no standing for the plaintiffs, that does leave the door open for the Supreme Court eventually to say, no, the government can't do this because this is obviously abridging people's free speech. It's the government motivating actors to silence U.S. citizens. That violates the First Amendment. They still could do that because they didn't rule here, Bethany, on the merits of the case. They sort of took the easy way out by saying that the plaintiffs didn't have standing. But I'm not hopeful.
I'm not either. I mean, this is a question that I have for someone who doesn't play a lawyer while they're watching reruns of Law and Order. Yeah. But, like, will we ever see an actual case where the defendants do have standing? Will the Supreme Court ever take that up? I mean, I imagine they won't. I think this was just them kicking the can down the road. But it's a terrifying infringement of our First Amendment rights to say that the United States government can sic private corporations on citizens to say no, those are the things you're allowed to say, those are the things you're not allowed to say. Right. It's boggled my mind how much we've memory holed COVID.
Yeah. Tell me about it.
I don't understand. Do people not remember how we were told to wear a piece of cloth on our face in order to go to the supermarket in 2021?
Yeah.
I remember people yelling at my children for refusing to do so. I wouldn't do that to my kids. I vividly remember people yelling at my children in the supermarket every time we went.
Yeah.
Why doesn't anyone else?
And the insidious nature of the infringements on our rights here that the government compelled is that they didn't have their fingerprints on anything. Mm-hmm. It's like saying, "Oh, I didn't murder that person. I just hired someone else to pull the trigger." Well, no, you're still guilty of that murder, dude. And that's what happened in this case. It's how Fauci can stand up there, under oath on Congress and say, "Listen, we didn't close any schools down because technically they didn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
They just issued guidelines for everyone to use to shut the schools down.
It's funny. I recently was on Instagram and I was looking at something that Mary Catherine Ham had posted on her podcast page. She has an amazing podcast. Everyone should listen to it, Getting Hammered.
Yeah.
And she...
I mean, Victor is really the star of that podcast, but I don't want to get into it. Go ahead.
Nonsense.
That's the hard part. He does the hard part, keeping her in line. Trust me. I do it every morning.
That is hard. So this is the problem with you having only female co-hosts. I think maybe you should learn a lesson. So she had posted something on her Instagram and there was that fact check. Remember that little fact check that came at the bottom of every single post about COVID?
Yeah.
And I saw, and it was obviously a fact check about how Biden, something like it was defending Biden. Yeah. And I thought to myself, my golly, I forgot about those fact checks. I forgot that you could not see a single thing about COVID. And the way that the social media companies knew you were talking about COVID, even when you were not, you would say something on your Instagram stories like, I'm going to give that a shot. And they would hear the word shot. And they would put the disclaimer on the bottom.
That's right. And they were doing all of that because they were compelled by the government to do it.
Yep.
That's the
power. The power of those social media companies was terrifying.
And so, listen, where does this stand? Well, there still could be a case. To answer your question, the courts could rule on this on the actual merits. By the way, listeners of this program shouldn't have been surprised. Our legal analyst, Joe DeGeneva, on Monday predicted this outcome, although he said he was concerned that they were actually going to rule on the merits, which they didn't. I want to read a little bit of Justice Alito's statement here because he was in the dissent along with Thomas and Kavanaugh, I believe. Sorry, I'm going off the top of my head. This is what Alito wrote. What the officials did in this case was more subtle than the ham-handed censorship found to be unconstitutional in Vulo, which is another case. But it was no less coercive. And because of the perpetrator's high positions, it was even more dangerous. It was blatantly unconstitutional, and the country may come to regret the court's failure to say so. The court, in punting this on standing, has basically said, you bet the federal government can compel speech and censor people as long as they do it through a third party. And by the way, they did it, as we've learned now, because of the Twitter files, the great work of Matt Taibbi and other journalists. They did it by intimidating and threatening these social media companies. A great little social media platform company you've got here. Sure would be a shame if something happened to it. Now, do these things that we ask you to do. And, when the FBI knocks on your doors and threatens you like that, they have a way of getting results. And in this case, the result was the censorship and silence of American citizens. I want to mention again, Mark Chenoweth, New Civil Liberties Alliance, will come here. He is, in fact, a constitutional expert. Although, one quick thing, though, Bethany, when you said, I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one when I watch Law & Order, and I get that. But the beauty of the First Amendment and the beauty of our founding documents and the genius of our founding fathers is that you don't have to be a constitutional expert to get it. They wrote these things in such a clear, cohesive way that any American citizen can look at our founding documents and say, oh, yeah, I get that. I know what that means. I know what my rights are.
One of the gifts of COVID was really, really tweaking and optimizing my BS radar when experts, quote unquote experts, would tell me things. I was like, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't. Yeah. I don't think that putting a piece of cloth on a 2-year-old makes much sense. Maybe there's going to be some unintended consequences. The experts assured me that there were not.
Yep.
So thank you to COVID for making me distrust everything and everyone.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks, COVID. Or should we say, shish, COVID?
Later this morning on the Chris Plant Show, it's the debate day at long last. Will Joe Biden be resuscitated for long enough to participate for 90 minutes? 9 a.m. on WMAL.
This is one of the most fundamental issues that we are facing. I wrote about this issue, this case, in my recent book, because you have one of the largest censorship systems in our history, if not the largest. It's been called Orwellian by lower court judges. And what the court is saying is that we won't hear you on this issue because you're not the right litigants. Now, I have to admit, I've always been something of a standing dove. I believe that these standing decisions are too narrow because they do prevent the court from rendering a decision on such important constitutional questions. So this issue will have to wait wait for another day. But one of the things that many of us have been arguing for years is that the government is engaging in censorship by surrogate. I testified about this in Congress, that they have made a mockery of the limits of the First Amendment by doing indirectly what they're barred from doing directly. They're using academic and corporate allies to bar and cancel and blacklist critics on a variety of different subjects. So it's going to be very frustrating for the free speech community, because we've been trying to see if there will be a final decision to strengthen free speech.
That's Jonathan Turley yesterday on Fox News. By the way, I love that term, free speech community. Who isn't in the free speech community? Honestly.
The ACLU?
That's true. And the federal government, sadly, or at least other letter organizations and agencies that work therein. Dr. J, I like to call him Dr. J because his last name is too hard to pronounce, and I'm pretty sure he's got a pretty good layup too, Dr. J. He was the doctor in question here, and he makes a good point. Losing on the standing argument means that the Supreme Court thinks the government, as long as it doesn't specifically censor a person, can censor ideas without violating the First Amendment. And frankly, I find that even more insidious.
Yeah.
That they've been given a green light here.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that there is there was a moment here for the Supreme Court to lay down the law. And I wish that Alito had the opportunity to write the majority opinion, because he's absolutely correct. It was terrifying. And now, the lesson that will be learned. What's wild to me is that when progressives and liberals do this stuff, they always forget that they're not always going to be in power. And I think we'll talk about that later in the show, how they're not always going to be in power.
That's right. And how will this, although will non-liberals use this new power, to silence their critics?
That's fascism, Larry.
Exactly. It certainly is fascism when the bad guys do it. Sean Davis at The Federalist also points out something in this decision. Let me quote it first. Citizens cannot manufacture standing merely by inflicting harm on themselves based on their fears of hypothetical future harm that is not certainly impending. Let me explain what that means. People would self-censor. People would not express certain opinions. Let's say, as you mentioned, Instagram or YouTube, you don't want to lose your account. You don't want to be deleted. You don't want to be removed from those platforms, especially if you actually earn income from that. And so when you see other people being censored and deleted, that changed your approach to expressing your ideas and your topics that you chose to discuss. That's censorship, too. It's preemptive censorship. And it's because of the government's actions. And the Supreme Court characterized that as inflicting harm on yourself.
It sounds like victim blaming to me.
It is, as Sean Davis put it, an abominable opinion, green-lighting government censorship. That's exactly what it is. And it's the Supreme Court sort of mocking people for seeing the writing on the wall and saying, okay, well, I better follow the rules and not say anything here, lest I suffer the consequences.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court looks at that and says, oh, yeah, so you're not, any harm you're suffering, you're doing to yourself.
So what's wild and what was interesting over the course of COVID was seeing incredibly brave people who risked everything, like Dr. J. And they were saying the things that it turned out that everyone else was thinking in their industry, but they were too afraid to say it. So for every Dr. J we have, there's 200 other folks who have their own stories of craziness. He has the stories from Stanford, but everyone else has crazy stories that they're just too afraid to say. So imagine when you have a Dr. J that there's 200 others who are too scared to come forward.
Well said. And I'll leave it on this because there's one other point to make about this whole thing, which has, yes, Bethany, frighteningly been memory hold so quickly. It wasn't that long ago when we had to live through this pandemic. Lots of the things that Dr. J was saying out there that cut against the grain, a lot of opinions that were being expressed, your opinions that you were expressing from your firsthand experience where you don't need to be an expert to see what's going on with a 2-year-old that is forced to wear a mask in the middle of a hot summer at summer camp.
Outside.
Those things were correct. They were true. That's the other part of this component, that what the government was censoring under the guise of misinformation, now we have discovered, and experts have conceded, were in fact correct and true. So the truth was being censored, and the lies were being promoted. And yesterday, it appears the Supreme Court is just okay with that. Mark Chenoweth, New Civil Liberties Alliance, joining us at 7:05. Right now, at 6:23.
Now on 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app.
O'Connor and Company.
It's 6:37 now. It's debate day, 27th day of June, and we're going to give you full coverage and analysis, and you'll hear that debate live right here on WMAL. So let me put it this way. Don't do any favors for CNN. Don't give them your viewership. Don't look at their advertisers. Keep it right here where you belong on WMAL. You'll still hear the debate. Coming up at 7:05, Mark Chenoweth, New Civil Liberties Alliance. 7:35, Betsy DeVos is going to talk about yesterday's roundtable with Speaker Johnson about Title IX. And then at 8:05, KT McFarland. It's Larry O'Connor with Bethany Mandel. Good morning, Bethany.
Good morning.
Bethany, did you ever consider the beauty pageant life?
You know, weirdly, I know you're going to be surprised by this. I have not. But
I didn't know where you were going with that.
But it's funny because I didn't think, obviously, I was like pretty enough and fancy enough for such things. But now I've learned in the state of Maryland, I didn't even have to be a woman.
That's right. Our Miss Maryland has something a little extra that previous Miss Marylands never had. That little extra is right between her legs. Yeah, Miss Maryland isn't really a her. And I guess we saw this coming. It was going to happen, as it were, so to speak. We talked about this at the crowning of Miss Maryland. And I remember watching the video of the moment. And you could see, most of the beauty queens, representing, Frederick and Silver Spring and everything. They're all sort of, doing the polite clap, and a couple of them are super excited. But you saw a couple of the contestants back there sort of ticked off and even walking off the stage during the whole, here she comes, Miss Maryland, the whole. And our pal, Mary Margaret Olahan over at Daily Signal, has an exclusive interview with 3 of those contestants who are not so happy that Bailey Ann Kennedy, a man who represents as a woman, was named Miss Maryland. And they're speaking their minds, 2 of them on the record with their names, one of them remaining anonymous. In the larger, before we get to those details, though, you have daughters. I mean, you've had to shepherd through all of these conversations, and of course, inherently, we feel compassion for the individual in the. I remember when the whole Leah Thomas thing happened. I was like, part of me was like, listen, anybody who's going through this process of being confused about what their sex is, and I can't imagine what they're going through, and so on a very personal human level, I do feel empathy for them. But this stealing the limelight and opportunities and accolades from to me, this has nothing to do with your struggle about your identity and how you fit into the world. It's a very aggressive thing to do. And I just wonder, as a mom, do you struggle with this on because you try to teach your kids compassion?
Yeah, no, I mean, Mary Margaret wrote an incredible book that just came out about the stories of these detransitioners. Yeah. And she was incredibly compassionate in her conversations with these individuals. And you do have to feel compassion. And that compassion, that the conservative compassion for these individuals is misconstrued as hate. The reality is, I think the compassionate thing to do is to not tell people that who have schizophrenia, for example, that there are in fact voices. I don't think it's compassionate to tell these individuals who have gender dysphoria that they are correct, that they are a man or a woman, depending the opposite gender. Yeah. But you're exactly right that this was not what Miss Maryland did in this circumstance. Kennedy did was a total play at making this into a battleground. This wasn't trying to be recognized as the beauty queen that he is. The intention of this was to make this pageant a battleground. Yep. But Kennedy said to ABC News, to be able to be in this position and be able to make an impact on my community, especially with the and I'm going to have to slow down, LGBTQIA. There's so many letters that were added to that.
Yeah.
This is exactly the intention that Kennedy had going into this pageant, was to make this into a statement.
I remember years ago when this story was, and especially with regard to athletics, I said, I have a teenage son. He plays high school volleyball. He's in college now, but at the time he played high school volleyball. And if for one reason or another, God forbid, he was going through this, and he felt like he was really a woman trapped in a man's body, and he was going through this transition. And I would obviously treat my own child with as much compassion and support as possible, yet at the same time trying to get him as much help as possible to, properly deal with whatever it was he was going through. But one thing that would be off the table is continuing to play volleyball. Yeah. It's like, okay, dude, listen, you got your thing and you got to work through this, and we're going to support you as a loving father will, however I choose to support you. But I'm telling you this, you are not going to dress up like a woman and play against women in volleyball, because you will hurt them.
Yes.
And it's not fair.
Yeah.
And frankly, parents should be able to say, you know what? You got a lot of other things to deal with right now in your life. Playing volleyball is not one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. No.
But for this person, obviously being a beauty queen was the priority.
Yeah. I mean, because ultimately this is, at the end of the day, from the majority of these individuals, a sexual fetish. They want to be recognized because they get off on that. He wants to be recognized as a beauty queen, and this is, he just achieved his life dream.
Elizabeth McCarthy is one of the contestants who lost to this Miss Maryland, and she told Mary Margaret Olohan at the Daily Signal, quoting now, "I first realized I competed with a biological man a few days after the competition." So they weren't told. Mm-hmm. I saw it on the Miss Maryland USA Instagram post. At first, I was shocked. I felt sick to my stomach. I was so upset for the other women in the top 5, and I was disgusted and disappointed that the pageant coordinators allowed women to undress in front of a man without any disclosure.
The dressing room thing really, really bothered me. They did not have informed consent about who they got undressed in front of. And that is so unfathomable. And that's honestly, if we're talking about the injustice of this whole situation, it's that they were thrust into a dressing room where they were getting changed and unchanged. And I'm sorry, you think that a biological man wasn't getting off on the fact that he was like this secret mole?
That's right.
Like he was wearing an invisibility cloak, and everyone around him felt comfortable, and he could see women in their natural habitat.
Yeah.
That's a huge part of that. Why are they so insistent that in order to honor and recognize their gender identity, that they are 100% entitled into dressing rooms and bathrooms and locker rooms and all these places? We can honor you as a woman without being in the bathroom with you. Why do you insist on being in a bathroom with me?
Good question. A little bit more on this and more revelations in Mary Margaret Olohan's very cool exclusive interview with 3 of the contestants in the Miss Maryland contest who just lost to a biological man. The article's in the Daily Signal, and we'll continue talking about it in a moment at 6:44. Continuing with this exclusive interview that Mary Margaret Olohan conducted at the Daily Signal with losing contestants in Miss Maryland. They lost to a biological male. I found this to be very interesting. This is from the one person who wanted to protect her privacy, contestant B. She says, "I felt lied to. I would have liked to know ahead of time, as I was subject to change, utilize the bathroom, and be in the same space as a biological man. It surely seemed like the organization and Bailey was trying to hide this fact until it was convenient to them." She also says, "I believe the competition was rigged. There isn't a doubt in my mind that it was not. For example, I think in previous years the pageant secured different judges. I think they were changed. Also, the staff were not respectful or pleasant. I understand that this is a pageant and it's a fast pace, but there's certain respect that individuals should provide." And then there's this. Contestant B pointed out that Kennedy is a self-described stay-at-home wife with no kids, which, by the way, certainly supportive of being a stay-at-home wife. And, well, no kids is kind of obvious unless they adopt because, there's no womb. Okay, moving on, though. Given that the Miss Maryland USA contest awards women not only for beauty, but for hard work and professional success, Contestant B found it odd that Kennedy would win without a job or a family. Quote, I met a lot of women who were moguls in business, philanthropy, and more. Bailey ended up winning without a job or being in school. How can that showcase or inspire women, young women, that they can do anything? And that, beauty pageants are like that now. It's about, getting an education and succeeding in business and all of these other things. I didn't make the rules. That's what feminists have tried to inject here. So now they finally decide to reward a trad wife, Bethany, who just stays home and takes care of her man. And of course, she's a man.
So this is the participation trophy. In order to the pinnacle of achievement for a woman is to be a man pretending to be a woman. And
yes.
this is what feminists have reduced womanhood to, that just being a woman is not exemplary in any way. We have to have a high-powered job, have kids, they can only eat organic, all these things.
Be a girl boss.
But if you're a man pretending to be a woman, that's enough, baby. You got it. You achieved everything in life that you need to.
Bake cookies and stand by your man.
Mm-hmm. But only if you're a man.
Only if you're a man. Great reporting from Mary Margaret Olohan, our pal, who has sat in that very seat.
Mm-hmm. And she just wrote a fantastic new book that came out pretty recently.
Yeah, we had her on about it. It's called Detrans, about the very courageous young women who were sold this lie. They altered their bodies because of the lie,
medical
and now
malpractice.
They're emerging. It's great stuff. And great stuff that we're seeing from the Daily Signal. Good for them. 6:52.